Uh, so my name is Parry Carter. I'm a researcher with the Pew Charitable Trust. And Pew is a public charity that engages in research and technical assistance at the local, state, and federal levels. And we study a variety of policy areas, and then we work with lawmakers to use our research to improve state results. So today I'll talk about what economic development incentives are, why they're important. Then I'll discuss Oklahoma's work within the Business Incentives Initiative, and then finally I'll end with a discussion of how to design a process to provide better data on the results of incentives. So everything states do in some sense is economic development. Education, investing in infrastructure, taxation, regulations, and so on. All of these things affect state economies in different ways. And what you're looking at here is a report out of Virginia. It's from the Joint Legislative Audit Committee. And it really shows that incentives are only one piece of the economic development puzzle. State strategies that are specifically for economic development include training, marketing, as well as financial assistance. So every state engages in economic development in some form, and so the key question is how to get the best possible results using the tools that states have at their disposal. So why are incentives important? Those states employ many economic development strategies. Far and away, incentives are states' leading tool to stimulate their economies. And they collectively have a fiscal impact in the billions of dollars a year. And they come with promises of hundreds of thousands of jobs. And so offering incentives isn't just a yes or no answer. There are a lot of ways to structure and administer incentives for different reasons, and the details really matter, and I'll show you why in a bit. So economic development incentives, they differ based on a number of variables. And the first is in how they're targeted. So a number of incentives are targeted by geography, right? So distressed areas, rural areas, maybe brownfield sites, for example, and also by activity. So job creation incentives versus capital investment incentives. And also by industry, so manufacturing or technological fields. And they also differ in how they're administered. So many states have both discretionary incentives, much like the governor's closing fund, and also what I'll call statutory incentives. Those incentives that involve meeting predetermined statutory requirements for payment. And I think a good example of that is the investment tax credit here in Oklahoma. And they differ based on how they affect the state budget. So tax incentives, grants, and loans, they all have different budgetary implications. And these payments are all designed to be remitted at different times during a business's growth as well. Yet all of these things, they're all trying to change businesses' behavior in a desirable way for the state of Oklahoma and everywhere else. So really, like I said, the details do matter when you're thinking about your incentive policies. And what we're looking at here, this is kind of a cautionary tale that shows how subtle design flaws can lead to ineffective incentives. So this is out of the Wisconsin Department of Commerce. It's a report on the state's film tax credit. And what you see here is a film could get 20 times more by importing a Hollywood director instead of hiring a Wisconsin resident. So there in green, you see the incentive amount is actually inflated. And the Commerce Department didn't design this incentive this way. It was just a simple design flaw, and they had to go back and retweak this. It's really helpful for states to think through the goals and implications of their incentives. So how does the state get the details right then? States have found that lawmakers really need good information on the results of their incentives in order to make good decisions. So, this is a challenge in a lot of places, including Oklahoma. In many cases, lawmakers have had to have made decisions on the basis of anecdotes and not on good information. And states have really been making big efforts to move toward good information. And our work in Oklahoma really centers on helping your state have better information. So now I'll get into the details of the Business Incentives Initiative and Oklahoma's role within that project. But first I'll talk a little bit about the genesis of this project. And so as I mentioned, states are doing a number of different things with their economic development strategies, specifically related to incentives. And we've been studying the ways in which states are evaluating their incentives effectiveness now for about 3 years. We put out a few reports, the latest of which was Evidence Counts. It was a 50-state assessment of how states were evaluating their incentives if they were indeed doing that. So after it was published, we began working with a number of states for technical assistance requests. So maybe a legislator or an economic development staff member calls and says, hey, we're categorized as trailing behind. How do we ensure we get the best return on our investment using these tools? And so through these processes, we really found that a number of states were doing some pretty innovative things related to collecting and managing data and evaluating their entire incentive portfolios. And that could be reporting, due diligence, analysis, anything really related to administering business incentives. So we started the Business Incentives Initiative in late 2013. And it's a project to engage economic development policymakers and practitioners from 6 states, and those are the ones that you see on the slide here behind me. And we've all been working collaboratively to identify effective ways to manage and assess economic development incentives, and also to develop standards and best practices related to these incentives as well. And so the 6 states that you see here were chosen really because they were sort of best in class in some aspect. Some had evaluated their incentives, a few had at least attempted to look at the effectiveness of a few of their programs, and some of the states had really innovative data management processes. For example, in Oklahoma, the state has a very sophisticated interagency data sharing process. So by way of MOUs, the Employment Security Commission, Tax Commission, and the Department of Commerce can all share information to verify that job creation figures are where they should be or where they're reported at. And actually, I think as a testament to the Business Incentives Initiative, Tennessee is actually emulating this process now. The Volunteer States Economic Development Agency and the Labor Department, they're now sharing data to monitor compliance. And going on, like Michigan had very strong state and local coordination in administering their incentives, which is rare in the United States. And Tennessee has a very strong due diligence process for businesses applying for incentives. So the idea was, we can learn from these states. The states can certainly learn from each other. And I think we saw a lot of that during a few of our cross-state meetings in DC. This collaborative model has really been useful thus far. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the details of the initiative. There are 3 themes that we've been thinking through, and we'll continue to think through these through the end of the initiative. And the first is data collection. So that's understanding what data are needed, what's missing, where pertinent incentive data are housed within a state. And second is the analysis. So evaluating that data to make educated, informed decisions. And lastly is accountability, and that's just reporting outcomes to the citizens of Oklahoma, to the media, and I think most importantly to the legislators who can make decisions based on this evidence. So we'll look at the timeline here. So I'll go through the timeline very quickly, and then we'll get into the Oklahoma specifics of it. So the first few phases were identifying strengths and opportunities and thinking through policy solutions. And that was up to December of last year, and now we're entering the implementation phase. And then I think the neatest thing about this initiative is we're going to publish a best practices manual that really accounts for all the work that these states have put in, and it'll highlight implementation strategies, policy solutions that might work for other states. And I know there's a bit of a buzz about this from the other states that are not participating in the Business Incentives Initiative, because I think it'll be a really helpful tool. So back to Oklahoma. So during phases 1 and 2 here, we were gathering input about many of the things I spoke about before, understanding what was working in Oklahoma, where the struggles lie, where the data gaps were. We also wanted to understand the efforts that were undertaken in the past. And Oklahoma as many of you might know, pulled together a number of committees and commissions over the course of the last 5 years. And I know Representative Dank has been leading a lot of those efforts, and I'm sure he'd be eager and willing to talk through some of that during the panel. So Oklahoma formed a core team, a core four, if you will. And it includes staff from the Office of Management and Enterprise Services, the Tax Commission, Commerce, and the Treasurer's Office. That's John Estes, Deidre Myers, Regina Burcham, and Don Cash. And along with the core team, we made a number of site visits this summer. And I don't want to go through the entire list, but I do want to highlight a few of them just to give you a flavor of what we were doing and with whom we met. So we met with legislators, think tanks like OPI, and the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. We met with the treasurer, the auditor, the governor's staff from Commerce, Tax, the treasurer's office, OMES, and we also met with the chamber 3 or 4 times over the course of last summer and fall. And that was at the direction of the core team. We wanted to engage the business community and get some insight into how these incentives were working. And ultimately, we wanted to be sure all parties were really reading from the same sheet of music, talking about opportunities for improvement and not attacking certain groups of incentives or a particular incentive. And ultimately, the core team wanted a policy solution that would ensure that the state's suite of economic development incentives is predictable, flexible, and competitive, both for Oklahoma's government agencies and the businesses. So in assessing opportunities and improvements, there was really a consensus around a few things. First was a comprehensive evaluation process to measure the effectiveness of Oklahoma's 70-plus business incentives. And actually, an effective evaluation could be designed to account for the remainder of this list. So second, defining goals. So providing purpose statements for new and existing incentives. And that'll really help with both the evaluation of performance and compliance. And really, if you think about it, you set goals, you need to understand what it is you're looking for before you sit down and try and analyze what is or isn't working. So third, gathering more data on incentive outcomes. And so often agencies, and we found this across the nation, will have pertinent data that could be used for analysis, but sometimes it's inaccessible due to, of course, to taxpayer confidentiality concerns and also frequently technological barriers. So last, improving revenue forecasting. And often it's difficult for the Tax Commission now to project future revenues due to the way that some incentives are designed. So in terms of policy solutions, we put our heads together and we figured out what Oklahoma would benefit from the most and who should be involved, and we thought through many different implementation strategies. And we've seen strong support for a rigorous incentive evaluation process that encompasses a lot of this on the list prior. So the panel will definitely get into that. So our goal has really been to take lessons learned from other states while designing an approach that is customized to meet Oklahomans' needs. So this is a project by Oklahomans for Oklahomans. And Pew, we were lucky enough to be able to provide support by way of technical assistance and providing examples of what other states have done. So any evaluation plan really involves answering questions, simple questions like who, what, and when. So which agency should be responsible for conducting these evaluations? You think through the appropriate timing of evaluations, and often states will look at similar programs together to compare them. So we'll get into what programs. So Rhode Island and Mississippi evaluate all of their tax incentives, where Florida evaluates only their economic development incentives, and Oregon evaluates only their tax credits. And in Oklahoma, some key economic development programs aren't on the tax side. As many of you know, Quality Jobs, the state's flagship incentive, involves cash rebates. So really a scope like Florida's seems to work well for the state of Oklahoma, looking at all economic development incentives on both tax and cash sides. So thinking through scheduling, we found that it's really difficult to evaluate for a state to evaluate all of their incentives all at once every year. It really often leads to superficial analysis and truly a lack of focus. So, instead, a rotating cycle of evaluations is much more common. And 3 to 5 years is typical if you're just focused on economic development incentives. And if you think about goals and timing, depending on the goal of an incentive, it might take a state a while to realize the ROI. So for example, a project involves new construction. A company and a government must go through zoning, they have to break ground, they have to build the site before they can fill it with employees and understand whether or not their investment was worthwhile. So also, as I mentioned, reviewing tax incentives with similar goals can really help evaluators compare the results of various programs and identify which provide the greatest return on investment. So Washington State has a number of aerospace incentives. So they group them together when they evaluate so they can compare them against one another. In Oklahoma, identifying goals will be key not only for evaluations, but also for improving economic impact. So thinking through who. This is another cautionary tale. This is a report out of Nebraska in 2010. It's a tax expenditure report produced by the Department of Revenue. And you see here, the Nebraska Department of Revenue has no recommendations. So this wasn't the first of these reports that was published, and it actually wasn't the last either. And this is kind of what happens when you choose maybe the wrong evaluation office. And it wasn't that the Department of Revenue, was being difficult or they weren't getting along with the legislature. It was simply that, revenue was focused on collecting and administering taxes, not providing policy analysis. So now Nebraska is working on a new evaluation process to improve on reporting outcomes. So we'll see what happens next. So really, who can tell whether the programs are working and how they can be improved? That's a question states should be asking themselves when they're thinking through their incentive policies. Who should be evaluating? And it always takes teamwork. Alaska, for instance, divides responsibilities for its evaluation processes through collaboration with the executive and legislative branches. And in Oklahoma, there's a really strong desire for this not to be a purely government-driven process. That could mean involving a private sector economist in some way, or a business leader in an advisory role helping to oversee the process. And it could also mean going outside of state agencies to perform the analysis. Like in Mississippi, for example, the University Research Center has been tasked with evaluating their economic development incentives. So evaluations can show states a number of different things. And first and foremost, evaluations can provide independent evidence that incentives are indeed working well. So Connecticut has a tax credit designed to spur capital investment in the state's distressed areas, much like many other states do. And an evaluation of that tax credit found that it was actually working quite well, and the evaluators recommended expanding the tax credit due to the program's strong results. And the study found that the incentive boosted employment, the state's gross state product as well, and it also generated enough additional tax revenue to actually pay for itself. So the evaluators said, let's invest more in this and continue to grow by way of this incentive. Evaluations can also point to ways that incentives can work better for businesses. So in Ohio, some of the state's key incentive programs required at one point a local match. Local governments were required to provide matching funds in order for a company to even qualify. And an evaluation found that these local matches really were costing businesses more than the incentives were worth. The transaction fees, the administrative costs, it just wasn't adding up on the balance books for these companies. And that's not to mention the financial burden that was put on these localities as well. So after the evaluation, the report really recommended eliminating the local match requirement. And that's not eliminating the entire incentive, it's just one piece of it that seemed to be holding businesses back. And so lastly, evaluations can help lawmakers improve the effectiveness of their programs. And a good example is in Louisiana. They too have an enterprise zone incentive. And at one point, the Economic Development Agency was using it to incentivize retail, hotels, and restaurants that really only serve local demand. And an evaluation showed that the incentive was simply displacing jobs in these sectors. rather than increasing overall employment as they originally had thought and planned for. So the jobs, again, were being shifted, not created. So a new store opens, folks move to that store, but no new jobs. So their net impact was marginal once they took a look at this. And so the legislature recommended that incentives in this program should be less focused in these three industries and more on maybe manufacturing or technology or something else like that. So I'll talk to you a little bit about momentum before we go to the panel. And so policymakers across the country are asking for better information. So the states you see here in yellow were regularly evaluating their incentives as of 2012. So that's when we put out our report, Evidence Counts, when we really started studying the ways in which states were looking at these tools. And since then, 8 states, shown here in green, yes, they're green up there too, have approved laws requiring regular evaluation. And I think it's really worth noting that in each state, all of these bills have passed with strong bipartisan support, which really goes to show that people who are supportive of incentives and also the folks that are maybe a little bit more skeptical can agree that better evaluation is needed. So our hope is that we can bring this momentum to Oklahomans. And this way you can have better data on the results of your incentives to help you design a policy that gets the best possible results for your economy, your taxpayers, and your budget. So with that, I will turn it over to David Blatt. We're going to switch, I think. So thank you for your time.